What is this discipline education? What is this as an academic area in the university? What is it as an area of study if we're going to become educators? And the answer is it's unusually tricky, to be quite frank, to define this discipline. It's relatively easy to define physics or English literature or law as another professional area of study. These are very, very distinctive areas with clear and consistent disciplinary practices. Education is unusually untidy and suffers for that, to be quite frank. So what I want to do in this short video is try to define what the discipline is, which is really to define what we're doing as thinkers and what we're doing when we learn education as discipline. And I'm going to start with this word science to try and define what education might be as a science. And I'm going to start with the meaning of this word science. So in English, there's a very narrow meaning of the word. And so when we talk about science in ordinary parlance, we usually think natural science. So when they say that certain politicians are anti-science, we're talking about natural science. We're talking about biology, physics, chemistry, geology, those kinds of things. The word science, however, is used in other languages, particularly European languages, in a much broader sense. So, and in fact, even in English, we use the word science more broadly when we talk about the social sciences, which is psychology, political science, library science, and all those kinds of things. So we do use the word science to describe human affairs as well. Now, the interesting thing is there's a very narrow definition of education as a science, which essentially uses methods from medicine and psychology to describe what, in the words of the Institute of Educational Sciences in the United States, regards to be the gold standard in terms of education sciences, learning sciences. And that is to say, look, we don't know anything in education unless we have an intervention group and we have a control group, and we give the intervention group an intervention and we compare the outcomes with a control group. Now, that's exactly what happens in medicine when they're trialling new medicines. Some people get a placebo, some people get the actual new medicine, and we see if there are differential outcomes between the groups. Okay, and that is regarded as scientific method. It's scientific method in medicine, and also it's scientific method in educational psychology and psychology generally. And in fact, the most rigorous forms of this are things that are called randomized controlled trials. So in other words, the people in the intervention and the people who get the placebo don't know which they're in, right? So it's blind, it's not, you don't know which is which. And in fact, the selection of even the people who go in the intervention group and the control group is randomized. It's and so on. So that is sort of an application of scientific methodology into education. And some educators think this is the only thing we can really know in education. We can only know things which have been through these rigorous scientific processes. Now, what I also want to talk about is another definition of the way in which the word science might be used. And actually, it's a definition which comes out of European philosophy. I'm going to mention later on two philosophers, Edmund Husserl and Jürgen Habermas, German philosophers, and they use the word science in distinction from another ordinary everyday world which they call the life world. I'm going to come to that in a second. But for them, science is basically any focused inquiry, anything that involves careful observation, theoretical conceptualization, deep thinking, systematic application, and premeditated conscious reflection on something. So that's a broader definition of science, and it's one that I want to use later on in this short talk. But I've got an even broader definition of science here, which is the Latin word for knowing is sciens. It's a gerund, knowing. So it's a process of knowing things in the world. And I want to sort of use that concept as well in order to define education as a discipline as I go on. Husserl and Habermas draw this conceptual distinction between science and the life world. So let me start off what the life world is. we know a lot of things in the life world. The life world is our everyday experience of the things we feel, our identity, who we are, our everyday lived experience, right? It's subjectively felt. And we know those things subjectively, and we don't often stop to think about them theoretically. We don't observe them systematically in the way that scientists do. They're just things that we know in a casual kind of way as incidental parts of our knowledge of the world in this informal kind of way. Science, by contrast, is a much more structured activity which involves systematic observation. It might involve systematic conceptualizations. So typically, scientific concepts have more precise definitions than the much more ambiguous concepts we use to describe things in our everyday lives. So there's a distinction then between these two types of knowing. Knowing in the life world. Now, that's not to discount knowing in the life world. Knowing in the life world is real, it's felt, and it's really important to who we are as human beings. And in fact, it is the grounding of everything we do in a whole lot of ways. It's our reason for doing things, it's our motivation, it's our identity. But to draw a distinction between that and more systematic ways of knowing, theoretical forms of reflection, systematic modes of observation, collecting data, trying to be relatively objective about things by getting multiple perspectives in a case study, for example. Those are all characteristic moves of science as distinct from the life world. The life world of knowing as opposed to the kinds of knowing that we actively do when we think and we act scientifically.